This is another in our series of reports on the life and death of Mr. Socrates, recently convicted and executed for subversion. With me tonight is someone who knew him well, Mr. Glaucon. Mr. Glaucon, some years back our station covered a notable debate between Mr. Socrates and one of our best-known foreign tutors, the famous Dr. Thrasymachus, on the meaning of justice. At issue was the question of whether justice was just a way of referring to the interests of the stronger in any situation, in other words, might makes right. You were there at the time, were you not?
I was indeed, and I well recall how Mr. Socrates used a series of analogies in which it was obvious that in some professions an individual in a position of power actually looked after the interests of those who lacked it. He talked about a doctor, a ship's captain, and even a shepherd. He argued that someone running a government ought to be seen in the same way as looking after the interests of those under him rather than just his own.
And you, of course, agreed with Mr. Socrates, did you not?
Actually, I found myself troubled by what he had said. I felt that regardless of these analogies, Mr. Socrates, to put it bluntly, failed to appreciate what it meant to have the kind of power we associate with someone who heads up a government. To make my point, I brought up an old legend regarding the founder of the dynasty that ruled the country of Lydia until it was conquered by the Persians.
You are referring to King Gyges, of course. We all know the story of how he somehow managed to induce the wife of the previous ruler to take part in a successful coup.
Indeed, but less well known is how he did this. He had begun life as a shepherd, but when an earthquake exposed the skeleton of a giant from the past, he was given an opportunity to change his status. A man untroubled by superstitious fears, he stole a ring that had been on the giant's finger. He soon learned that by twisting it a certain way he could become invisible.
I see. Invisibility would not be all that useful if he remained just a shepherd.
But it would give him a definite advantage if he wanted to get into the palace, seduce the queen, and persuade her to cooperate in her husband's murder.
So you are saying the thief becomes a king because of a magic ring. But what is the point you wished to make with Mr. Socrates?
It was a very simple question. We know what a thief might do with the magic ring, but what would we say about a supposedly good and decent individual finding such a ring?
Such an interesting idea. I would like to imagine someone who lacked all criminal tendencies using such power only for good.
You mean he might put on a costume and become a superhero fighting for truth, justice, and the Athenian way?
Why, yes, something like that.
Ah, but now what if you know that with such power you would never have to suffer the consequences of a crime? After all, is it not the case that you and I obey the law and respect others because we fear being caught and punished?
So you are saying that the only difference between the criminal and the upstanding citizen is opportunity? You are implying that the criminal just takes his chances while the rest of us are afraid to do so.
Exactly. And that definitely put Mr. Socrates on the defensive, no small feat in itself.
And did he have an answer?
He did indeed, but it involved making the case that there are, as it were, three parts of the human soul. We are all aware of the first, which would be those drives connected with survival and physical satisfaction.
Like food and sex, I suppose.
And money, of course. However, we look to our athletes and our brave warriors as having a higher set of drives that will allow them to keep their eye just on victory. Mr. Socrates used the term noble emotions to refer to the psychological traits involved.
You said three parts. What is the third?
That is the power of the mind itself. And Mr. Socrates insisted that those who were best endowed with it would be able to use their noble emotions to control these other drives that lead to criminal behavior. Someone who was truly wise, he said, would know the true meaning of justice and so be unable to act unjustly.
But is that not taking us full circle back to the question of whether there can be some real meaning to that word, justice?
Obviously so. Mr. Socrates claimed that someone who was truly wise, that someone who had the right intuitive awareness, would then be immune to temptation.
So that was his answer to the challenge made by the story of Gyges? I wish we had more time to explore this, Mr. Glaucon, since already I see so faint things following that definitely disturb me. It would seem Mr. Socrates would then advocate that only his supposedly enlightened minds should be rulers over the rest of us more ordinary mortals. But we must leave that for another program.